Hola a todos, bienvenidos a este ciclo de charlas de políticas públicas. Yo soy Cynthia Goytia, soy la directora de la Maestría de Economía Urbana y del Centro de Investigaciones de Políticas Urbanas y de Vivienda, y coordino este ciclo que hoy tenemos a un invitado que lo tenemos en Los Ángeles, ¿no? En Estados Unidos. Para mí es un placer presentar a Eric Heikkila, un colega con el que venimos trabajando últimamente bastante en los últimos años. Eric es profesor y director de Global Engagement en la Universidad de Southern California, en la Price School of Public Policy. Es un economista y un profesional con experiencia también en planificación urbana, y es el autor de muchos libros, quizás algunos que alguno de ustedes puede haber utilizado cuando estaba estudiando, de Economics of Planning, y otro relacionado con China y Estados Unidos, perspectivas de políticas. Y también ha trabajado mucho como consultor para el Banco Mundial, para UNDP, y otras organizaciones, y además ha sido profesor visitante y coordina una serie de seminarios y estudios en distintos países del mundo, un gran conocedor de la cultura de Southeast Asia, del sudeste asiático. Ahora vamos a hablar con él un poquitito sobre temas de ciudades y sudeste asiático. Hecha toda esta presentación, y bienvenido Eric para estar con nosotros, welcome here.
Gracias.
Voy a cambiar, habla algo de castellano, pero yo voy a cambiar a empezar a hablar en inglés. Entonces, el tema de hoy es una pregunta. We think about, can open societies thrive in closed cities? And what we plan in this session is to explore this broad question. You remember that during the last 3 weeks, we have been giving new reflections about some of the key debates and issues as a result of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. Our attention today is focused on the influence of these COVID-19 related policies in cities from countries like US or Southeast Asia. So one main idea is that in relation to this pandemic, the relationship between government and civil society and technology is changing fundamentally. So my first question for this presentation would be, well, what is happening with this new wave of policies and people-government interactions in cities? How these changes can be conceptually explained? This is some part of your presentation that I want you to, these are the questions that I want you to address. And the second is more practical. Well, what examples, what can we see, what examples from cities can you bring us, considering that you have a lot of knowledge of many countries and many places, particularly Southeast Asia. So the screen is yours. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to join you for this. I was able to watch last week's presentation as well. I thought it was very interesting, very well done. And so I hope that I can contribute accordingly. And my apologies porque hablo español muy pobremente. Resultado es mejor para mí por hablar en inglés for this charleta. So I can share screen here, I think, and I'll do that now. You can see the screen now, is that right? And blow this up. Can you see this okay?
Yes, it's okay. Wonderful.
Okay. So what I'll do is begin with some kind of general overview, actually drawing on things that I've done in the past on perhaps related but different topics, because we had no COVID previously, but there were other things that I think have relevance to what we're experiencing now. And one of the things that I'd start with is this observation that, we've talked a lot about globalization, and for the most part, globalization has been discussed in terms of the way that all parts of the world are linked sort of economically through trade. I think one thing that we're learning is that we're not just linked through trade, we're linked biologically now. We're linked through a shared global ecosphere. And so we are connected. Not, this isn't a policy question. Pandemics don't arise because we decided to have a pandemic. It's a manifestation of the fact that we live together in a shared biosphere, ecosphere. And we, I think, tend to lose sight of the fact that we are actually biologically linked to one another. And that's being brought back to us in a big way. But also, we're linked through ideas. Ideas also spread. Good ideas and bad ideas spread like viruses around the world. But that also gives us an opportunity for collective action. And that's where I think the policy element comes in. And it also reminds us of our common humanity. So we are shared, part of what makes us globalized is that we have a shared humanity. And cities are, of course, important venues for all of this. And cities, one thing that's intrinsic to cities is the fact that they provide this venue for openness to each other. But when we have things like pandemics, and we find ourselves having to close ourselves off in some way due to invasive threats, then that creates a tension between openness of society in many ways that we want to promote, but also are trying to be closed to invasive pernicious influences that we want to guard against. And so I think all of us are going to be involved in rethinking how we do that. So I don't pretend to have any big answers here, but I think that by looking at what we observe in some cities around the world, and I'd like to choose some cities that I'm a little bit more familiar with and that I've had exposure to recently, to talk about how this common pandemic is interfacing in different ways in different places. And perhaps when I'm finished with this, we can also bring it back to the Latin America context, for example, which I haven't included here just because I figure much of the audience is already based in Latin America, and they don't need me to come in and tell them about what's going on in Latin America. So on the conceptual level, begin with this notion of invasive progression. And this diagram is actually one that I produced for the book that you mentioned, Cynthia, a book that is just coming out this year on China from a US policy perspective. And in that book, each chapter looks at a different sort of policy realm within the United States. So it might be trade policy or environmental policy or labor policy. But one of the chapters looks at homeland security. And so that chapter is asking about how does the rise of China influence sort of the policy domain in the United States from a perspective of homeland security. And by the way, I was writing this chapter before the pandemic hit. And then when the pandemic hit, it was really surreal. It was quite surreal to be sort of finishing up a chapter on this topic as the world is being engulfed by a pandemic that had its origins in China. So it brought relevance, extra relevance to this. But I find this conceptual link between the different elements of invasive threats to be useful. Now, these are the different departments. The department, DHS, refers to the Department of Homeland Security, and HHS is Health and Human Services. So in the context of the different kinds of threats that are homeland security threats from the US perspective, and I think from the perspective of any country, we begin with the food and drug safety. So in governmental terms, it's the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of Health and Human Services, which looks at certifying the safety of food and drugs that are brought into the country from abroad. And because the US has been trading more and more with China, for example, and the US is generally, again, we talk about open societies. So this is part of that tension. We're thinking about, well, what is the role then of guarding against, for example, food products that we ingest? The thing about food and drug safety is these are things that we put into our body, right? And if there's something wrong with it, if the food or the drugs have a problem, we're ingesting that. And so that's doubly invasive. And so Food and Drug Administration deals with that, and we don't need to get into the details. But then we have another progression. So this is the first step in the progression of invasiveness. If we take that general problem we had with food and drug safety, if we add a certain element, that being infectiousness. So these four items here are really the link from one type of invasive threat to the next. So it's already one type of invasive threat to think that we might become ill due to something we consume. But if we add the element of infectiousness, then we find ourselves where we are now. So this is a way to think about our current situation in some broader context, that communicable diseases are not only might I get ill from something that happened, but if I become ill and I have contact with you, you might become ill. And then you might have contact with someone else, and this has a way of spreading. And so these communicable diseases bring us up another level in terms of this kind of invasive threats. And of course, the governmental agency that responds to that most directly in the context of the United States is the Center for Disease Control. Now, if we add yet another element, if we take what we have now, a kind of pandemic, and we add the element of intentionality, that brings us into the sphere of bioterrorism. Because I think all indications are that the current situation that we have was not intended. It's something that was sprang upon humanity, but not because we were intending for that to happen. But we know that in an era of bioterrorism and of terrorism generally, if we add intentionality, and this is something that I'm actually quite worried about. I was worried about this already, as evident from this diagram, but if we think about now, of all we know there are groups out there that do intend harm, would love to do harm, whether it's to the United States or elsewhere, or to civilization as a whole, who are no doubt looking at all of the damage done by a pandemic and think, well, if we could create pandemics and release those, think of all the damage we could do. And so if we add that element of intentionality to what we already have, then that brings us into the sphere of bioterrorism. And then the CDC is also then working with Department of Homeland Security. Now, oops, sorry, this, if we then add the cybersphere with this intentionality, well, then we have viruses of a different kind. We have viruses that infect our computer infrastructure. And if we add other realms to that, then we have other forms of critical infrastructure. So, and what we've seen is that just the one that we have now, just the pandemic alone, is causing damage throughout all of these. If we add elements of intentionality, if we bring that intentionality into the cybersphere, and if we bring it into other realms, what we're experiencing now could be just a foreshadowing of what could happen. And I don't want to, be an alarmist, but I think, as I said, this diagram is something I produced before anyone heard of COVID, certainly before I had heard of COVID. And so it helps to put what we're experiencing into some perspective. Then there's the question of how we respond to these hazards. And Cynthia, you had mentioned this sort of evolving role. Now, this particular diagram is actually one that I produced a few years ago when I was working on a project in Italy with their emergency response department and with Bocconi University, which I think you know well, Cynthia, in Milan. And there we were actually looking at things like flooding and fire and other kinds of natural hazards. And we were looking at the evolving role between, on the one hand, the kind of the population at large, civil society, government, and technology. And in particular, we were looking at how social media might be utilized to respond in new and innovative ways to common hazards, whether they're earthquakes, whether they're floods, whether they're fires. And now, of course, there's the context of pandemics. So at that time, so at the time when I was producing this diagram, what I was suggesting we might consider is a kind of new paradigm that moves us away from a kind of government-centric response to hazards, whether they be pandemics or flooding or other kind of hazards. And so the conventional paradigm, as I say, is a kind of government-centric one where a hazard, H, comes in and then government, kind of big government aligned with big technology, then provides a kind of big response, a kind of government response to the prevailing threat. And so, for example, if we think about a flood, the government, say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the government would be monitoring where is the storm coming, where is the flood coming, using the technology available, and then it would have massive sort of government intervention to mitigate and to respond to that threat. The evolving paradigm that we see is one where the role of technology is not a massive technology, but is a technology that we're seeing today, which is more finely articulated and linked to individual people. So that, and actually in the context of COVID, recently a colleague of mine here at USC in the Viterbi School of Engineering, he's a professor of computer science, Bhaskar Krishnamachari, who shared with me this idea that he was proposing, and this is something that I believe is catching on quite a bit now in circles, which I think what he's proposing here represents what we're seeing here in this sort of person-centric response. This still involves government, but the technology is much more distributed. So we each have our mobile phones, and if there are ways of certifying, if I've tested, for example, positive for COVID, then the phone already knows where I am. So if there's a trusted third-party way of verifying this, then if I come near you, even if you don't know who I am, even if we don't communicate, our phones can communicate. And through this mechanism that's being proposed by my colleague here, your phone can be informed by my phone that the person holding your phone, which presumably is you, has come within range of the person who is holding my phone, who presumably is me. And so we don't even have to know who each other we are. We can remain anonymous, but it allows us to see this kind of contact. So this is, I think, a very nice example of this lower paradigm that I'm talking about, where there's a more finely articulated technology and a more finely articulated population, that we're recognized as individual people, not as a mass population that needs to be directed, but rather we're individuals who are in individual circumstances, individual places, individual contexts, and the technology has already adapted to that. And so the government's role becomes a different one here. And so we're no longer in a person-centric paradigm, but one that government-centric paradigm, but instead one that's more person-centric. Of course, there are potential problems with this, that these distributed technologies can be everywhere. We've seen that drones have become much more popular. Now, I'm originally from Canada, and my father's family comes from northern Canada, which in the springtime probably has more mosquitoes per square meter than any place in the world. They're awful, but one can imagine that instead of mosquitoes, we have these e-mosquitoes. We're not so far away, I think, from at least the technological feasibility and even economic feasibility, where any one of us could have an army of these mosquitoes that we can send out. Right now, they're large enough that you can see what is that up in the sky, but these can become the size of real mosquitoes. They can become smaller and smaller, they can be everywhere, and they can be watching everything. And then the question is, where are they feeding those data? To whom are they feeding those data? So this idea of the distributed technology raises a lot of questions, including questions about privacy. And that brings to mind this cartoon from the New Yorker, where presumably FBI agents or some Secret Service agents knock on the door of some household and says, "We understand you're not happy with our privacy policy," which of course raises the question, how did they know we weren't happy with their privacy policy? They're eavesdropping, right? They've got their e-mosquitoes out watching us and listening to us. So there are a lot of opportunities with this distributed technology in responding to these kinds of threats, but there are also a lot of challenges, including how we structure ourselves in society and how do we have these kinds of safeguards. And of course, the way these questions arise will be different from place to place, and that's why it'll be useful for us to look at some different cities. Now, in terms of this human technology interface, and I think maybe I should just go over this quickly because I think we might run out of time, but I'll just say that there's a general trend as well that the technology is becoming closer and closer and closer to us. We're probably now at a stage of integration. Before, technology and humans were separate. Then they were coupling. Now they're more and more integrated. And we may be coming to a point where we begin to see convergence. And convergence can look different in different spheres. We may have virtual places. We may have investor robots. We may have social operating systems, I think, as a kind of mode of governance, as can bring in, and instead, and in the transportation sphere, it may be trans-constitution. It may be we replicate ourselves elsewhere. In terms of education sphere, we may be convergences where the touring interlocutors become prevalent. And in terms of communications sphere, convergence may be that we're essentially dealing with thought mail. So it's not clear where all of this is heading, and that we could spend more time on that, except time won't allow. But what we're seeing then is that on the one hand, we have this technology is interfacing with us in a way that is both expansive and infusive. On the one hand, it's allowing us to expand. On the other hand, it's allowing others to expand into us. And so it's invasive and expansive at the same time. And this will lead to moral and social dilemmas. And I use here just the example, again, not to be alarmist, but I actually do think it's almost inevitable that this is the direction we're going. What happens when it becomes possible to sit at your device and download destructive capabilities, nuclear weapons, or other destructive capabilities, simply to download them and send them out and operate them? I think we're moving into that. But that means if we're going to guard against that, that means we have to be sufficiently invasive that if someone moves to do that, we're able to catch them. But who is it that is watching? So this is at a very kind of fundamental philosophical and social level. It's on the one hand, it's exciting in terms of what's possible. On the other hand, can be very troubling. And I don't think we've begun to figure out how to do that. So we might move now, since you've suggested that I look at some different cities to kind of think about how these are playing out. And this will be somewhat personal kind of view of just some of the cities that I've been interacting with recently. And so it's a somewhat personalized account, not meant to be too scientific or exhaustive, but maybe it'll help raise some questions. But I'll begin by just taking a look at how this pandemic has been progressing. You can see China here. As we all know, this began first. This is a logarithmic scale, by the way. So as it's moving 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, 10,000 to 100,000. So this is a logarithmic scale. And we can see that China rose months before anybody else. It peaked, and these are deaths, by the way. I decided to use the deaths just because it's harder to fake a death. It's still possible to misassign. So for example, we've seen that in China, they're not showing any more deaths from this coronavirus, essentially. And that may be because there are no more deaths from coronavirus in China, or it may be that deaths that are occurring that might have been assigned to COVID are being assigned to something else. I don't know. What we do observe, the top line here is the world excluding China. So if we take China out of the world trend, what we see is this sort of outer envelope where the United States is contributing, unfortunately, very heavily to that. You can see Italy was an early contributor beginning to die off, Brazil rising very quickly. In the case of Asia, Japan beginning to rise. So this just gives us some sense of the timeline to help reference what is happening where and when. This is the graph that I just showed you was cumulative deaths. This one is daily deaths. So it's what's happening day by day by day. And you can see, again, this is just looking at China and then the rest of the world excluding China. And you can see that there are very different patterns, But in some ways, it's not the pattern, but maybe the timing that's different. So China rose early, peaked early, and then according to the data, fell. Then there was this huge spike in terms of daily deaths. And this was, in a sense, I think, an accounting adjustment, right? So there must have been some decision at a central level that certain deaths that had not been attributed to COVID in retrospect should have been, and so they're added in. So we get this giant spike at the end. And after that giant spike, boom, it's closed off. And according to these data, there have been no more cases in China. And in the case of the world outside of China, we see that there was about a 2-month lag, and then, in a sense, a fairly similar shape of trajectory, up and then sloping. We haven't yet found the downhill. If we look at the China example, maybe there's reason to think that there's a downhill coming soon. We just can't be sure. And in a way, it still depends on what we all do, because part of that does, of course, depend upon social response. And we'll see that that varies as well. So now let's take a look at some of these places. I'll start with Beijing, a city that's near and dear to my heart in many ways. And of course has some iconic representation. But I'll start first with thinking about, this is actually the Beijing from 40 years ago, during really the era when, during the Maoist era, so before the opening up, before China and Beijing began to transform. So it was really during the, where the communist kind of ideology was very much governing how production was organized. And a key element of that in cities was this concept of danwei, which is essentially means sort of single unit workplace. And in the 1970s in Beijing, your danwei was kind of everything. That was where you worked, that was where you lived, it was where you ate. These were very self-contained units. And again, that was partly based on kind of ideological notion, but these danwei were both ideological, organizational, but they're also physical. And that brings to mind this notion of cellular automata. Many of you may be familiar with these, but cellular automata are essentially, it's a kind of software that is kind of cell-based or unit-based, and it moves progression to sort of period to period, discrete time periods. And what happens in any one cell, next period, depends upon the data that are observed this period. And one can write, these are actually fun to play with. I've had, done a little bit of work. I think they're great for urban modeling because you can look at what happens. It's a very place-oriented way of modeling change, and where there doesn't have to be a grand oversight model, but instead can be sort of cell-based. And that's what again makes me think about these danwei, right? That these individual cells might be danwei, and how do danwei respond, and what the meaning of the output is, a white output or a black output or a green output or a red output could have an economic interpretation, it could have a disease interpretation, it could have a social network interpretation. These are very kind of fluid sorts of modeling devices. So I just introduced that as an interesting way to think about how we might model cities in the context of these kinds of events. Now, of course, if we're looking at China, we're talking about the difference earlier we were talking about the difference between society, sort of civil society government and technology. And in China right now, that there's a very different construct, very different fundamental construct between the role of civil society and government and technology. And that's evident in the way that this pandemic has played out in the China context. There are sort of positives and negatives about it. One of the most heartbreaking scenes we saw from China in the early days, this is a very famous case of Li Wenliang from Wuhan, who in late December, early January was beginning to notify his colleagues on social media that, hey, there's something going on here that's very wrong. This disease is something is here that's highly infectious, it's spreading, this is dangerous, this is a real problem. And he was visited by this security in China. What messaging is very centralized, and messages that come out of civil society that are counter to messages that come out of central committee, central society, are simply not tolerated beyond a certain extent. And that can have very unfortunate outcomes, as in the case of Dr. Li here, shown early as he was beginning to grapple and try to respond to and warn people about the virus. And then he himself became infected and he died. And there was an outpouring of grief in China for this. And again, the central government was having to manage that in a very kind of careful way. I hate to say it, but pretty much everything there was political first and everything else second. But then social control was exercised. This is a very nice picture, in my view, taken in Beijing during the early days of the clampdown, giving an idea of just how these neighborhoods were quickly brought under control, and social distancing was put into effect in a very thorough and comprehensive way. And so in some ways, from a disease pandemic perspective, this is the flip side of the coin. This is where, well, having centralized organizational structure, governmental structures combined with technology and social control can be good when it implements to enforce measures at the individual social level that restrict the spread of the disease. And if we believe the data that we looked at earlier from the Chinese context, well, maybe there's some positives and some pros and cons of this particular kind of governmental structure, and something to think about. And we'll seek some contrast with Los Angeles and elsewhere. But also in the context of Beijing, even though we talk about social control, in the context of housing, and this is an area where we've been doing a lot of work. Cynthia and I are both doing some work on informal housing from a global context, informal settlements. My colleague Annette Kim here at USC has done some interesting work in the context of Beijing, and my colleague Julia Harton has done work as well in the context of Shanghai, looking at how informal settlements in the context of China are not what we might see in LA, for example, with homeless sleeping on the streets, or in Latin America, where we see the villas of Argentina or the favelas of Brazil. But in the China case, what happens is you have formal structures. If you're outside looking, you say, well, this is all formal housing, but the way it's used is informal. You may have 10 families living in an apartment that was built for one, or 10 individuals living in an apartment that was built for one family. And so informality manifests itself in different ways under different circumstances. And that in turn will interface with the way this pandemic might spread. Now, if we go to another city, just taking a sort of tour around, again, an iconic vision, there's again a kind of centrality in the case of Japan, but the centrality is very much a kind of symbolic centrality of an emperor. So in China, there is no emperor, but there really is. And in Tokyo, there is an emperor, but there really isn't. So they're kind of two different cases. But but if this is not where the emperor lived. This is where I was living 6 months ago when I was living in Tokyo. This was the view of my wonderful back patio. Viewing this makes me miss it. I have so many nice memories of this. And so Tokyo is a very well-organized city. One of the things that really amazed me living in this apartment was how strict the recycling was. I was really observed. All of us living in this apartment building were under sort of constant surveillance, really. I mean, it's friendly surveillance in a way, but it's very much surveillance regarding recycling. And one thing that really strikes me when you're in Tokyo, if you've just finished a drink and you want to throw your cup someplace, there's no place to throw it. If you can believe this, they don't have trash cans because you're not just supposed to throw trash away. And of course, there's no trash on the street. So it gives you a sense of how pervasive the social organizing is. Remember when I talked about convergence and I talked about social operating systems, Japan has a very different kind of social operating system that down to the level of where you put your paper, waste paper, where you put your waste plastic, where you put your waste food products, each has to go in a different container and they have to be put out, and almost daily, I think it's daily, they take what we send down and we have to package them there's a room set aside for this. And then the building manager, one of the reasons the building manager watches us so carefully is whatever we don't do, he has to do. So he wants to make sure we do it so that he's not obliged to do it on our behalf. And then everything is picked up. And it's picked up in those different groupings. So it's a different kind of social control, a different kind of social operating system. There's a centrality, but there's no emperor, or at least we don't think there is. And it's society in general, walking around, it's very pleasant, very normal, very, very carefree. It is in Beijing too, by the way. And very civilized, very human. You know, this kind of social organization has a very human face to it. I loved seeing the way they would look after children. So well organized. The children all, you know, they're so well cared for. One really has the feeling that every corner of society has been carefully thought through. Yet, sometimes that centrality does not allow for the individual initiative at the social level. One of the big things that was happening already half a year ago when I was living there, the coming Tokyo Olympics in 2020 was big, big, big. And much of the world was revolving around it. And already as late as March 12th, the governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Koiko, says canceling the Olympics in 2020 is unthinkable. 2 weeks later, it was canceled. But this shows that the flip side, while in Japan, so many things work so beautifully, if somehow the mechanism is off, if the guiding mechanism is off track, and they're thinking no matter what, the Olympics are going forward, even when they should be preparing. So if Tokyo can prepare for a pandemic as well as it prepares to recycle its waste, Tokyo ought to be very well positioned to protect its citizens against the pandemic. But if it loses sight of that objective, they know they need to recycle, but they don't know they need to protect against the pandemic, because doing so is unthinkable, because canceling the Olympics is unthinkable, then you get off track. Now, this interface shows up in a different way in the context of Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong, of course, has a very special and unique history. There's Hong Kong, has this historical legacy as a former British colony. It physically abuts mainland China. When the coronavirus first began to spread in China, now, of course, this interfaced with the political realm as well, which made things very complicated in Hong Kong, because there's a lot of protest. As I think all of you are aware, there's, especially among the youth in China now, there's a strong sentiment that we are not part of China. We are Hong Kong. We are separate, and we have our own identity, and it's not an identity that's linked to Beijing, and we don't care about the basic agreement, etc. And so the COVID virus, when it was first manifesting itself in China, tended to exacerbate some of these political tensions then between Hong Kong and China. Of course, now it's working the other way, as China is looking to guard itself from a second wave of the pandemic coming back into China through portals such as Hong Kong. This is just, for me, Hong Kong is in fact a special hybrid culture, that this is the Gongsik Ilai Cha, which means the Hong Kong style hot milk tea, which is sort of modeled after the British tea, but is its own thing. It's not at all like British tea, but it was modeled after that, but it's become its own thing. And to me, this kind of represents Hong Kong, that yes, it's inherited some of these qualities from its colonial legacy in terms of institutions, language, and other things, but Hong Kong has its own identity. But there it is, right on the border with Shenzhen. And this pandemic then is intermingling. So this link between government, technology, and civil society, and how to respond to a pandemic when there are such fundamental stresses already in place between government, civil society, and technology. It's very difficult. Singapore, where I was living until just for the early part of this year, that's a view out back over I was living just back there behind the trees. This is one of my favorite places to go and get a nice bowl of beef noodle. These kind of shops, this is kind of Singapore kind of at the granular level. But even February 1st is when I took this photo. The Singapore government, this was very early, February 1st. This was very, very early, but Singapore is very sensitive to what's going on in China. Many of the visitors coming from China. So there was already, as soon as it became clear that there was a potential pandemic coming out of China, Singapore really was on the alert and was very early to cancel flights from China, even though it's very dependent upon Chinese visitors, And I think at first there was a bit of a mask shortage. Everyone was urged to have masks. The residential unit in which I was living provided me with a mask, but we weren't, at that early stage, February 1st, we weren't asked. In fact, we were advised there is no need to wear a mask. I think because they didn't want to have a run on masks, and also because they were looking at the data, and those data had not, pandemic had not yet really reached Singapore in any significant way. And so this was the photo I took in mid-March, just a couple of days before I returned to Los Angeles. And you can see that people are intermingling. No one there is wearing a mask. But I think a lot of people were starting to feel nervous. This was just mid-March, and the cases were starting to rise. Everyone's getting a little bit nervous. Now, these data shows that there was reason. You can see here is mid-March. So again, February 1st is when I took that photo of me with the mask on. But you can see there's almost nothing happening until we get into mid-March. And it was just about the time I was getting on the plane and getting ready to fly back to LA that cases were beginning to rise and that nervousness was rising. Then about a month, within 3 weeks, the cases in Singapore really began to rise. And the orange bars here indicate these cases are coming in through migrant workers. So the real pandemic hit Singapore hard, not in terms of visits from China, but workers coming from across the border. Singapore is in effect a large city. It's like if Buenos Aires were its own country, if metropolitan Buenos Aires was its own country, and across the border was the country of Argentina, across the other border was the country of Bolivia, or Uruguay, that's really what Singapore is. It has the jurisdictional features of a country, but it's a very wealthy country, and wealthy people don't want to come in and do menial chores. So there's a labor supply from across the border, from across Johor Bahru in Malaysia primarily, but also from Indonesia coming in. They were the ones who brought in this infection. And these are the conditions under which they live. And so there's this kind of dual message in Singapore that says, well, yes, we've got a lot of cases, but don't worry, they're migrant workers. It's not circulating in the population at large, which is comforting and troubling at the same time. Now we're running out of time, so I'm going to just jump ahead. So I came home then back in Los Angeles. This is sort of the watching the pandemic progress. This relationship between government, society, and technology is very different here. There's a lot of pent-up frustration. People are told to stay at home. This cartoon catches very nicely the sentiment of it's not just the dog that wants out, the cat that wants out. We all want out. Let us out, please. But in terms of monitoring, there's a lot of monitoring going on. You can see that Los Angeles County is earning a D- in terms of social distancing. And the role with society. Be careful what you wish for, right? If we wish for society to be deciding how to respond to pandemic, I'm not so sure I would rather be here than in Beijing when a pandemic is underway, because there's a term that's been employed in the US called COVIDiots. These are people who get out and essentially are not social distancing and are spreading the disease and are arguing that this is a question of fundamental freedoms rather than of fundamental responsibilities for protecting one another. And of course, housing as well comes into play here. And there's a tension then between government and science. This is Dr. Fauci on the right, a very famous kind of iconic representative of the medical profession, who is having to sort of push back against his boss, who is making statements about how society should respond to a pandemic, based largely, I believe, on political motives rather than on medical guidance. And of course, it's not just a political problem between politics and science, but also in exacerbating existing tensions between China and the US. So I'm very sorry, Cynthia, to have taken so much time, but worried that I didn't have enough to provide, I think I prepared too much.
No, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Eric. I enjoy it very much. Let me, to finish, let me ask you one more question, and then we are going to close this session. You know, we are working together on informal settlements, and you know a lot, or you are knowing now a lot about informality. So how all these issues that you raise in your presentation can be related to what's happening in what are the lessons that we can learn from all that you show here?
I think one is this notion of social equity and inequality. What we are seeing, certainly in Los Angeles, certainly in Singapore, but I think in many places around the world, it's already those segments of society that are already marginalized, that are already struggling, that have low incomes, that maybe have a single parent household, or who maybe have diseases, that the impact of these kinds of this pandemic is hitting those populations disproportionately. And those are often found in these informal settlements. So doing work that is already underway to prevent or to provide better housing outcomes through smarter land use regulations and other measures, we may be not only dealing with a housing problem, but we may also be addressing a lot of co-related social justice issues at the same time.
Thank you, Eric. Wonderful reply to my question. And let me turn to Spanish because I'm going to present the next two seminars. Muchas gracias a Eric, y yo a toda la audiencia les comento que tendremos 2 eventos más, uno el martes que viene con Karen Chappell, profesora de la Universidad de Berkeley, y vamos a hablar justamente de este tema de desigualdad y todo lo que tiene que ver con desplazamiento urbano, digamos, los problemas de evictions y hogares de bajos ingresos desplazados en la pandemia mundial del COVID-19. Y el 2 de junio vamos a estar con otro colega mío y gran amigo, Daniel Rodríguez, también de la Universidad de Berkeley, director del Instituto de Estudios de Transporte, y vamos a hablar sobre el futuro de la movilidad urbana post-COVID y los retos y alternativas. Así que muchas gracias a todos, muy contentos de haber compartido esta sesión con Eric y muchos elogios en el chat para vos. So, congratulations y nos vemos la próxima semana. Hasta luego.
Cheers.
Bye.